A warm welcome to everyone. Welcome to Central's live webinar. Today, we're going to talk about the power of digitization, a practical deep dive into gaining efficiencies in due diligence. We have some great panelists with us here today. That's Scott Dechter, Central's Head of Investment Management Solutions. Our host today will introduce in just a moment, but I have a few housekeeping items that I'd like to talk to you about. First of all participants will be on mute during the duration of the webinar. If you see the QA tab at the bottom lower navigation within Zoom, please use that for your questions. Please share your questions throughout the presentation and we will try to answer each of them live during the webinar. And if you have any questions that we don't get to, we'll follow up with you directly. So I'm going to turn it over to Scott. Scott, please take it away today.
Thanks, Alice. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thanks for joining us. Joining me today, as Alice mentioned, are three young ladies from various aspects of the compliance or investment management community. So we'll go from south to north and see if I can find myself geographically acclimated. Kim Baker, joining us from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and University of North Carolina Management Company. Good morning, Kim.
Good morning.
And then I'm going to go further north just a little bit to Washington, D.C. Tammy Salmon, Associate General Counsel or Deputy General Counsel. No, Associate, I had it right the first time for the Investment Company Institute. Good morning, Tammy.
Morning, Scott. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, thanks for joining. And I'm going to stretch up to Boston. Nicole Wong, Chief Compliance Officer for Mercer Funds and Mercer Trust Company. Good morning, Nicole.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Anytime. Thanks for joining. So we have a kind of a fluid agenda today. We're going to be talking about a number of things, all under the scope of how to gain efficiencies through and via digitization, which is a big word. What we're going to cover today is number one, leveraging technology and how it can improve third-party compliance oversight. The second one are mutual benefits between the GP and the LP for compliance and investment oversight. How some real-world examples of technology's role to meet the increasing demands, and we're going to talk at length about the regulators here for data and transparency. To that end, we're going to speak to the new questionnaire, the DDQ, that came about after 4.5 short years of work by the Investment Company Institute. And we're going to touch further upon that lovely process known as 15C and how automation can help along the lines. So without further ado, I'm going to go back in the order there and say, Kim, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your role at UNC?
Sure. My name is Kim Baker, and I have been at UNC Management Company for just over 5 years, and I manage their CRM software and work with the investment teams directly within the operations department and have been managing the DDQ, the annual process that we have here, for the past 4 years.
Great. As an industry leader, Tammy Salmon, can you please share some light on your role? Because you seem to have your views and your participants, your constituents among all different aspects of the puzzle here. So a little about your role and ICI and how it fit into the landscape, please.
So I'm Tammy Salmon. I'm with the ICI's Law Department. I've been with the ICI for 30 years. And my responsibilities include running our Chief Compliance Officer Committee here in the United States, an Internal Audit Committee here, and a Chief Risk Officer Committee here. And then in London, I have responsibility for a Compliance Committee and an Internal Audit. And these committees have an awful lot of synergy between them because they're all looking at the same issue, but just from a different perspective. So it's really interesting to me to see how the same issues play out across the compliance, audit, and risk functions within ICI's member firms.
Thanks, Tammy. Up to Massachusetts and Nicole, could you share some insight to the group about your role in what you're doing there at Mercer?
Sure. I've been with Mercer about 8.5 months, closing in on 9. So not a long tenure with Mercer particularly, but learning more each day. So I have responsibility I am the fund CCO. So I do have an indirect reporting line, or depending on which day of the week, direct reporting line into the independent chair of our fund board. I'm also the chief compliance officer for Mercer Trust Company. And we are a manager of managers, and that's significant because we outsource all of our investment advisor functions, the investment management functions, to sub-advisors. And of course, we have a host of other service providers, custodian banks, fund accounting agents, and the like, distributors. And so we spend an awful lot of time in due diligence mode, whether that's initial, annual, 15C annual, new advisors. We're constantly moving advisors in and out of the lineup for the funds and the trust company products. So we spend an inordinate amount of time in due diligence mode. So very interested in efficiency.
In deficiency or efficiency? I'm sorry.
We want more efficiency. We don't want deficiency. No, more that I'll always take more efficiency and effectiveness for sure.
All right, well, great. That brings me to kind of our first topic. And when we look out at the landscape here, I see a convergence or an intersection of the following three functions. And I'd be interested to hear initially from Nicole and Tammy about this. And that is the intersection of what we'll call regular ODD, investment due diligence, and compliance due diligence and oversight. They both fall under the broader control and oversight governance within a risk management umbrella, but can you speak to your perspectives on that dynamic?
Yes, I mean, there has to be an awful lot of commonality in these different roles within the company, because, you know, while compliance is charged with writing the policies and procedures, they may not have expertise in these other roles, but by the same token, they need to know what's going on and they need to be able to evaluate them on a regular basis. So there's got to be an awful lot of commonality between the roles, and you can't have silos to be effective in all those areas. So it's just really crucial. I think one of the strongest skills that chief compliance officers have is their ability to communicate with all the departments within a firm to make sure they're on top of everything. They're not going to have the expertise to do a deep dive in all the areas, but at a high level, they need to know what's going on and be on top of things.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. Absolutely. At Mercer, we have an operational due diligence team that is a separate function from compliance, is really outside the investment scope as well. So they're out there doing operational due diligence work. We actually have commoditized that at Mercer. And so they sort of have their own remit, if you will, but we try to triangulate with them and with the investment team, who's also performing, as you mentioned, investment oversight of the sub-advisors. Triangulating between the compliance team, the operational due diligence team, and the investment team is crucial for exactly the reasons that you said, Tammy. We can't be everywhere and know everything, but there clearly are groups who are focused in on certain aspects of the functions that have been outsourced and have crucial information. And when you pull it all together, you have a much more complete picture of where the risks are, I think.
Yeah, and Nicole, that also helps take off some of the load from the compliance officer. When you can rely on these other people to do stuff that, but for them doing it, you may have to do it.
Yes, I completely agree.
Interesting. I see two main drivers here. One is regulation, and its friend enforcement, and then transparency, which are closely aligned as two of the drivers there. If you add on a third element to that, which is the sheer volume of data, it's exploding among what's required, what's not required, what is desired. To analyze that, when you add those two together, how does that drive your ability to analyze data digitally? And I'll ask you, Kim, to opine on that.
Sure. So having a repeatable process in a scalable solution is really imperative, where we can ask all of our investment managers. In our case, we're an allocator and endowment. So we send out the same questionnaire to all managers, and getting back in that same format is really crucial. We also do something that they appreciate and we can use as well. And that's that we send out the previous year response inside the questionnaire so that whoever is answering that survey from year to year, they can read last year's response and they could click, yes, that's the same answer this year, or they can just make a small adjustment. I mean, some of our data is numerical. Typically, and your tool also allows flexibility where let's not send them previous year AUM because that's going to be a new number anyway. So the flexibility in the scalable solution is really, really great. And then some features on the back end where we can analyze the information and evaluate the data is really important.
Interesting. So you have outsourced your managers there. Nicole, you mentioned that all your funds are sub-advised. Does that pose a risk? And if so, what?
Yes, yes, yes. I would say if I had to just hone in on our biggest risk or the biggest risk that I'm managing day to day, it is the outsourcing risk. It is the responsibility to oversight these service providers we've engaged, and ensure that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that cuts across a lot of different topics. For example, I have a guideline monitoring team who performs an oversight of investment guideline adherence. So the managers are responsible to manage their money in accordance with the restrictions, but we do have this oversight function that is like the second set of eyes that looks at that. So that's just one aspect of that risk that we're managing. And then there's your more traditional sort of supervisor due diligence oversight risk that we're managing. And then there's, we under 38A1, we have defined service providers that we need to be monitoring. I have to report on that at the end of the year to our fund board. So that truly is, I think, our biggest risk at Mercer.
Interesting. And now as the volume of the number of external parties, the complexity of the data grows, it's hard to throw people at that. Fair statement.
Yes. I think scalability, and Kim kind of spoke to this a little bit, scalability becomes really huge. When you think about the increasing regulatory requirements and some of the ones coming maybe down the road, regulations increasing, the amount of data being pulled in increasing, growth of the firm. So fortunately, we're at Mercer, we are growing. And so we're introducing new products, we're bringing in new clients. The platform is expanding, and unfortunately, you don't get to keep hiring people. So the challenge is, how do you maintain or even improve your level of oversight given the expansion of assets, data, regulation? How do you kind of at least maintain an acceptable level of oversight and not hire 50 people? So that's where the technology becomes incredibly important, and that scalability becomes incredibly important.
Interesting.
Scott, can I add a couple comments?
You sure may.
So I want to follow up, what Kim said is, that the ability to have a repeatable process is really crucial to efficiency. And I would totally agree with that. And as I mentioned, I, work with ICI's internal audit committee, and I've seen the internal audit members of the internal audit committee create the repeatable processes for their compliance colleagues to better enable them to track what they're doing and to enhance their efficiency, which that's been a great partnership. If you're not currently working with your internal audit department, I would look into that. And to Nicole's point about the outsourcing, what's really interesting to me is when I think about outsourcing, I think about, Nicole or Kim, doing the due diligence of their sub-advisors and all. But just within the last month, we've seen headlines, and both of these were out of Ignite, where clients are being exposed to having their data, put into the public domain or whatever, because the vendors that your outsourced vendors are using have had a breach. And we saw that with the SEC too, in one of their recent breaches. So you can't really just focus on your outsourced provider to make sure they're doing what they say they're doing. now you got to be thinking about, oh my gosh, if they're using another vendor and that vendor is compromised, what does that mean for us? Because at the end of the day, if that information is compromised, it's your violation, it's not your vendor's violation. And I can't help but think that based on these recent headlines that we're seeing, that the SEC is going to be focused on this as they, consider more initiatives relating to outsourcing and as they do examinations of the effectiveness of your outsourcing.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that the requirement for investment advisors to have monitoring policies in place in advance of their procuring a third-party service provider to manage one of the covered functions, which is up for its own debate. That's been pushed to 24. We just discussed that earlier. It was accepted back in October of this year. Cyber's kind of taken a front and center to that. Kim, in your program, does third and fourth party diligence come into play for you?
Service providers from an SSAE SOC compliance, definitely. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, any of them. So do you go down, I'm not sure if you're looking at managers, but are you asking of your managers who their service providers are?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And that's something that we track every year in this, repeatable process, and it's in our survey standard questions. We also ask, who are the prime brokers that they use, custodians, administrators, and we also do our own. Tammy, you mentioned the compliance team, and checking for that information is really important. And so we definitely are doing that in the internal audit process. We report up the SOC compliance of any of our third-party vendors.
So you mentioned it's compliance, it's due diligence. We're talking limited resources over here. Organizations large and small. Tammy, you work with them all. Nicole, you're one of them and you work with them all, as do you. What that kind of prioritization and paralysis are two words that both begin with P that fall into place when you're trying to define a plan forward. How does that impact you and your member organization specifically, Tammy?
So, as you mentioned, we represent funds of all, shapes and sizes. And so it really differs for the organization that we're talking about. We have some smaller organizations where, you have 4 or 5 employees and they've got to do it all. And so they can be very flexible in terms of adapting their program as you see things come out of the SEC and all. But then when you look at the larger firms, which may be part of a bigger complex, a bank holding company or an insurance company or whatever, a lot of times the oversight is dictated at the corporate level, and they have an office that's in charge of overseeing vendors and making sure the contracts are in place and they've got the proper terms and that the due diligence is done and the oversight is done. And that can make it kind of complicated when you drill down to the asset management arm of that firm, because the asset management arm has to be compliant with all the SEC regulations, and they may not align with what the corporate entity is doing. And you see a lot of maturity in the larger organizations just because that they're bigger organizations, they've got more resources, they have more expertise. And then the problem comes when the SEC wants to define what your outsourcing should look like. And if you look at the outsourcing proposal from last year, you'll see the SEC proposing to impose very prescriptive requirements, including on contracts and the things you're supposed to look at and the timing of this and how you're supposed to do your oversight. And that becomes incredibly problematic for a mature oversight program, because what it would mean is you may have to disrupt your currently effective program in order to accommodate the SEC. And one of the things that was troubling about the SEC release to us is if you read it, there is no justification in it for having this whole new prescriptive oversight regime. They talk a lot about different things, but none of those are a basis. For instance, they say, if somebody's deficient in their oversight, it'll give the SEC the ability to act. Well, the SEC has brought enforcement actions for ineffective or negligent oversight. So you don't need this new rule to do that. And it also had statements in there about how firms before they retain a vendor may want to conduct due diligence of that vendor, and they may want to have a written contract with that vendor. I don't know any asset management firm that doesn't conduct due diligence on every vendor that they use and have a written contract with every vendor that they use. So if that's the gap they're trying to fill, it doesn't apply to asset management firms, because they have to have these processes in order to be compliant with the current law, particularly the compliance program rule.
Thank you for that. And that makes sense. You mentioned that the global umbrella that you're dealing with here. We tend to focus on the United States, right? Because that's where we live and practice. But I'm sure, Kim, your program may have global managers. You're mostly on one of your groups, Tammy, specifically North America, but you do have some European influence as well. Mercer, you're a global footprint there. Jurisdictionally, does that pose a challenge for you?
Yes. Yes, we are global. At the moment, our oversight process is regionalized. And so we share a common technology platform, but each of the local compliance teams in a jurisdiction are actually managing the oversight of the service providers in that jurisdiction. And of course, the challenge, this is obvious, but each jurisdiction has its own unique requirements. There may be some commonalities amongst them, but there are particular regional jurisdiction requirements that must be adhered to. Our local compliance team is far more tuned into that, far more knowledgeable about that than, say, the U.S. team would be. However, one of the under the theme of efficiency and effectiveness, one of the things that we are exploring at Mercer is taking a bit of a different approach and trying to become more harmonious, trying to sort of globalize the process a bit more. We're trying to find those commonalities. Where are we really all the same? Where are some of these basic requirements pretty much the same across the board? How can we almost even build a center of excellence that may take some of the burden off the local compliance officers? Maybe there's an administrative component that one centralized team can take care of for everybody. The idea being that you want your compliance team to be focused in on the issues that are coming out of the review of the responses from the respondents and the documentation that is being sent in. That's really where the value add is in highlighting the issues and the risks that you need to be focused in on. It's easy to get mired in the administrative aspect of it, especially with a large organization globally, that there's just a lot of moving parts. And that's really not where we want compliance officers focused in on. So that is something we are looking at. We're starting to talk about it now with the idea that we may come up with something to implement in 2024.
So Nicole, I hope you're plugged into my London Compliance Committee. We created that committee, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, and it was for the exact reason that you mentioned, is you've got all these non-US requirements that don't align with US requirements. And yet you got to synthesize everything because it's one organization that's doing all this work. And it really hit home to me this week because we're in the process of planning our next London meeting, which will be in October. And we're going to get a law firm from Ireland to speak to the group about ESG, because right now that's uppermost on there. My next to consumer duty, that was our last meeting discussion. So when we met with the attorney who's going to present to us, we met with him virtually on Monday. And he said, well, I'm really well versed in ESG requirements in Ireland because that's where he's based. So I'm not so well versed in the EU's or the UK, but I've got a general familiarity with, and that just points out it's not just US versus non-US, it's US versus all the different jurisdictions outside of the US, including Ireland, the EU, and the UK. And you got to synthesize all this to make sure you have one compliance program that's going to be compliant with everything, right?
Right. And then there's Australia and New Zealand as well, who are very active in ESG. Those regulators are very active. And of course, I feel like each regulatory body almost goes out of its way to have its own unique view and its own unique interpretations. So as try as you might to have a very globalized program, there's always going to be that aspect of it that makes it very, very challenging. But you know, you just have to sort of try to harmonize. I think we have to try to harmonize where we can to minimize the administrative burden, again, so that we have the bandwidth to focus in on those nuances.
Interesting. Thank you for that. When I work and talk with different people, and this is around the globe, that are considering adopting technology for this, there's, again, when you work with a compliance team, they have very acute needs that have consequences. You have investment teams that have their own angle and operational risk and due diligence there, all quasi-aligned. But when they're doing, when this process and these processes are done manually, a couple of points jump off the page and it's consistent across. And I'd like to hear some reaction to that. And I'll start with you, Kim. A couple of them. Number one is doing it manually leads to errors and inconsistencies. The second one, it's inefficient. And we talked about throwing people at it before. The lack of standardization and compliance across. Difficulty in auditing and tracking. And I've thankfully never been the subject of an SEC or a regulatory exam. I don't really want to be, but that's one that jumped out at me. Limited scale and adaptability. And the last one is last on the list, but it's probably the most that perception-wise, the most applicable. And what that was decreased security and privacy risk. When this is being done, and there's a commercial out there about maybe WhatsApp, it's the chat function, and people are sending texts back, and they said it's the most least secure form of communication out there. Of those, what risks do you see by doing it manually? And do you look to mitigate, did you look by going digital?
Yes. So the first year this was done, I wasn't involved, and we did use a technical solution. There were holes in the data that we then had to throw people at. So looking up and mining the information from our various investment managers, suppliers, what you will. Year over year, we've iterated and improved our processes, which includes making sure we get answers from the manager, maybe coding things in your technical solution to say this question is mandatory. And then we do quality control reviews over the data. So making sure we get 100% response from all suppliers or partners is really crucial. And then doing a deep dive on many of the aspects or the questions and responses, that's where your bread and butter is. That's where the rubber hits the road. You have to analyze the information, and you have to have experts in your various departments, not just in operations, because we are the ones that gather the data and do the majority of analysis, but then the investment teams have access to this. And since our data is going to be fully integrated into our CRM solution, which is another really great aspect of Central and why we chose your platform, then the information's in our big enterprise tool where the majority of people have access, and then we can write reports from there. So the business intelligence and the analytics is really important, but the first part is, do we ask the right standard questions, and then are we getting response? So there's a lot of different work that has to be done. Having good relationships with your managers as well, and making sure they know the survey's coming, and there's a lot to it.
Thank you for that. I've found this to be a three-legged problem when it comes to assessment-based diligence, and that is you're asking the question. Hopefully the question's getting answered, and then it's back to you where you now question the answer, right?
Yes.
So that's the collaboration there. It's further my understanding that while we are a tool for this, and that's one of the problems that we're solving there, the word collaboration is key, because this data is not singularly focused to reside in our platform. Great analytics, what have you, but it's to be consumed elsewhere. You're a large organization, Nicole. Your constituents, as we said, Tammy, are both large and small. Data collected through a compliance process or through an investment or ODD process is meant to be leveraged and consumed elsewhere. Is that something that you're hearing from your membership or from internally? Do you see, Nicole?
Internally, not so much. And that may just be a cultural thing. Mercer's a large organization, and we not only have OCIO business, outsourced CIO, but we also do consulting. And so there's still a large consulting business. I don't think that they have the same needs in consulting that we do in the investment management space. So we don't typically share our compliance reviews with those folks, but the operational due diligence team does. So I guess I would even say within the different functions that are performing some type of oversight or diligence, they each have sort of their own needs, and they each have sort of their own audience. So I might not necessarily share 15C material outside of the fund board and the need to know inside the investment team. But the operational due diligence team is probably, I know, sharing that information with, say, the consulting team or the investment team and others.
Tammy, on your side, any feedback to that?
So, when you talk about data, to your point, when firms are, taking in a lot of data or creating a lot of data, and to Nicole's point, it's going to be used throughout the organization. So you need to make sure that the data that you're relying on for whatever function you're performing is the data you need, because it could have been enriched somewhere along the way by somebody who's also reliant upon that data. So when I hear data, what I'm really concerned with, and we've talked about this in our compliance committee and internal audit, you need to make sure you have the golden copy of the data you need for your function. Because if you don't, that's going to skew everything. And then you're going to have to go back and get at the heart of the problem. So when relying on data, make sure it's the data that's the pure data that you need for your function.
That's important. Kim, you're nodding. Is that sorry?
We have a question
Okay.
related.
We have a bunch of smart people here and then me, so we can answer it.
Here's the question. How do you ensure all your managers answer the surveys and don't just let it get buried in their inboxes?
I gotta hang on one second, Kim. I got a nod from you. I got a shake of the head from Tammy, and Nicole's perplexed. So
No, it's a huge issue.
okay, Kim, I'll let you start.
Okay, so I think some of it might be in the numbers, but there's definitely thought that goes into this. So one of the things is alerting your managers and maybe using your best contact who has a relationship with them to say the survey's coming like a couple of days in advance. We also tell them what the email address is going to be that the survey is going to come from. So it's kind of at a high level, but it's also got some detail in there. Then the great thing about the tool in the digitization is that we can see if the managers received the email, we can see if they've opened the survey, if they've even clicked in, and that's real power for us. We can then also monitor through the software if they've started answering the survey. And so I use that, my team and I use that to make sure that managers are answering. And then we do the old-fashioned thing. We email a reminder and say, hey, are you, did you receive this? Are you getting it? And sometimes I kick it up to management to do if they're not answering me. We also use a corporate mailbox. So there's a lot of thought that goes into this because managers don't just answer anybody. Everybody's on guard about spam and phishing emails. So we have several corporate emails or, and people in the business who know these people. So there's a lot to go into it, and it's not always easy to get the managers to respond.
Yeah, I would agree. We presently use software that will be replaced with Central. Actually, we're kind of at the beginning of our journey. But presently it's a huge administrative challenge because it's clunky software. To your point, sometimes the emails go into spam. Just for some reason, sometimes people outside in different countries aren't able to log in. There's all kind of sort of like administrative challenges that can occur. And then beyond that, there's of course, people have a lot of competing priorities, and sometimes these things just slip to the end of the to-do list. And so we have to manually reach out and remind them. And we have a way to do that through email, but to Kim's point, we can also work through the client-facing teams to try and get to the right people, to sort of ask them to complete the questionnaire. We do have to manually monitor right now the completion and submission of the various questionnaires. Again, very inefficient, very human reliant. We're trying to move away from that and leverage the kind of technology that Kim was just talking about, again, to make things a little more seamless and to use our time in a better way than sending out reminder emails or tracking people on a spreadsheet, who's responded, who hasn't. The other thing is sometimes firms respond to the questionnaire and skip questions. And so, again, that's another manual process for us, is going through and looking at, were all the questions answered, and were the right responses put with the right question? Because sometimes they respond and it's not paired with the proper question. It doesn't kind of make sense, and then you have to sort of figure that out. So we're looking forward to having a solution that will solve some of those administrative problems for us, and get us away from spending our time doing that.
So Scott, I mean, this is a huge issue for funds and advisors. It's a longstanding issue. It's something that we've spent a lot of time and energy talking about. And I thank whoever asked the question, because I feel your pain. And it's typically an issue for smaller and medium-sized advisors or funds because they don't have the leverage. The large firms have the leverage to get the information they need. And so, that their questionnaires, their due diligence calls are going to be responded to, but that's not necessarily the case for the smaller ones. And I give you a perfect example. And it's not just as part of the due diligence process, but the SEC years ago was very focused on 12B1, distribution payments. Yep. And there's a specific requirement in 12B1 that requires broker dealers that receive 12B1 payments to provide funds specific information. Broker dealers won't provide it. Again, they'll provide it to the big ones. They won't provide it to the, even though it's a legal requirement and they could be cited for it. And we've raised this with the SEC. We've raised this with FINRA, say, you guys need to do something to compel them to provide this information. And it's crickets that they refuse to do it. And it was interesting to me, one CCO from a large firm that, has a broker dealer shop within it. I was dealing with the fund side of the house, and he was saying, I can't get this information internally. Our broker dealer's not providing it to, the funds they distribute, but they're also not providing it to us. It's like, if they can't get it internally, I mean, what hope do we have? And this is a huge area of vulnerability, because if you're not getting the information you need to conduct your due diligence, then you're going to be vulnerable when the SEC comes in and asks for your due diligence files. And you can't say, well, they haven't responded. We're still waiting. We're going to, that's not going to be a satisfactory answer for the SEC. And I appreciate, software will, help make this easier. And to the extent that it's the large firms that are, populating the information that gets into the software, that's great. But smaller firms don't have the resources necessarily to buy the software, to hire people to help them with this. They've got to do it all in-house. So this is a real struggle for smaller firms particularly.
Yeah, and I'll answer the question empirically, because it's asked a lot. And there's two things I'll say before I give you the number. And that is, the tool is designed, if you give them a tool, and this is the respondent, that is designed to make it easy to leverage answers, to have an answer bank and all that stuff that works on their behalf. If you give them a secure platform that's SOC compliant, and you give them the attestation that, yes, this is secure. It takes that concern off their head so that they will use it. It make it easy to use. And one client came back to us, and this is a big number. Over a 2-year period, they sent over 6,000 questionnaires across investment and operational due diligence out to managers of all sizes. And in that 2-year period, there were 116 that were responded to late. Everything else was responded to completely and on time in the platform. So when you have that type of response mechanism, the type of accuracy and efficiency, as well as completeness, it makes it easy. And if you give them a tool to do that. So I hope that answers your question 4 different ways. Which leads me to the next kind of item here, which is going to dovetail right into that. And for years, we've worked with industry bodies, AMA, ILPA, now ICI. Everyone has their own standard questionnaire. PRI, you can go ESG. There's a number of different fashions. As soon as you call it standard, people want to make it their own, and which eliminates the standard. So you undertook a process, Tammy, with your constituents for the ICI DDQ. Can you speak to that and tell us about the goals and where that stands with you? Because I think it'll align with the questioner's question as well as the path we're going down here.
Yeah, I agree. And it's a nice segue because, to the discussion we just had, we came up with this document, and if large firms are filling it out, or if large firms are compelling their subs to fill it out, then that's going to provide the information to advisors of all subs or of all sizes, which you don't have today. So the project that Scott's talking about is about 4.5 years ago, at a meeting of my risk committee, one of the members said, is there any way we can build uniformity into the due diligence process as funds oversee their sub-advisors? Because today it's totally a bespoke process. Everybody sends out their own questionnaires. They can be a couple pages. They can be very lengthy. The questions are all different. There's absolutely no uniformity. So from the perspective of a sub-advisor, they're spending a lot of time and energy responding to all these bespoke due diligence questionnaires. So I took that concern back to the CCO committee, and they concurred that, yep, this is something we can do something about. So we created a working group, and it literally took 4 years to do this. And we were meeting monthly. So it's not like, months would go by and we weren't doing anything. We were meeting monthly, but it was that tedium to put this questionnaire together. And we had both fund advisors and sub-advisors, and Mercer was actively engaged in this process, Nicole's predecessor, because we wanted the perspective of sub-advisors. We wanted to make sure if a fund is asking a question of the sub-advisor, it made sense for the sub-advisor that they would readily have the information. Yes, they're routinely providing this, as part of their due diligence process. And on the fund side, we wanted to make sure that we weren't asking any questions that were not going to be of value to the fund. So we resulted in putting together, and we first deployed it by in a Word document and PDF. It's a due diligence questionnaire. I don't know if you can see it that well, but it's incredibly lengthy. It's like 138 pages, 192 questions in it, but each of those questions typically has sub questions or charts. What we're hoping is this is a comprehensive due diligence documents that the funds could provide to their sub-advisors. A sub-advisor would only have to fill it out once, and then that document can be shared with all the funds that they sub-advise for. So yes, it's going to take the sub-advisor a long time to fill it out initially. To Nicole's point, each year, they'll be updating it, but they fill it out once. And that relieves them of having to fill out all these bespoke questionnaires that they get from the variety of funds. And we know, some subs work for or sub-advise for over 200. So it's an incredibly tedious process to get through. So we're hoping that this document will make this process more efficient, will give advisors, funds of all sizes, the relevant information they need. Because if a large fund is saying, I want you to fill this out to their sub-advisor, once that sub fills it out, then every fund will have access to their information if the sub works for or sub-advisors for that fund. And Scott and his team at Central have been incredibly valuable to us as we went through this process. Once we finally deployed the document, we wanted to, broadly distribute it to the compliance community to get sub-advisors and funds to start using it. And when we deployed it or provided it to Scott, they went through it, they loaded it onto their platform, and they brought back to us some issues that we hadn't contemplated as you translate the document into a compliance platform. So we worked with them on those issues. We tweaked the document, none of the substantive questions, but was some of the preliminary questions, because as I mentioned, a sub will fill it out once, but subs are getting these requests throughout the year from the funds that they sub-advise for. So you've got to tailor the intro part of the document to make sure that it's accurate when the sub is providing it to another sub-advisor later on, or another fund during the year. So we tweak some of the stuff at the beginning of it just to accommodate kind of those administrative concerns. And I think it's a better document as a result. And we're huge fans of, Central and Scott and his team for trying to automate this process to make it easier for sub-advisors to fill out and for funds to get the information.
Well, thank you. That was a natural segue. We've talked about regulation driving different processes, policies being created, adding people to the problem, asking the question, questioning the answer, challenges with that. I come back to a maxim that I've heard throughout the past probably 20 years. I'm going to date myself now. And someone once told me, it's all about the data. It's all about the data. When you think about that, and you think about the number of managers, the data complexities, the number of external parties, the nature of the ask, and then the follow-up ask, collaboration and reporting and analytics are really the end game here, but it's almost going to be a midpoint once we get there. But the end game of reporting and having this data in one place, I like using the word centralized, but it's a shameless plug, in one place. Kim, from your perspective as a practitioner there, I know that you're collecting all types of different data. And then if you think about the horizon of time and different lenses, how is your reporting and analytics going to improve?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a famous saying, if you can't measure what you can't manage what you don't measure, sorry, and KPIs are key performance indicators. So garbage in, garbage out, the focus is on, are we asking the right questions? Are we getting the right answers? So it's send out the questions and then review the answers, make sure the answer that they gave you matches with what your expectations are. And year over year, when these same managers or give us information about their firm or their fund or strategy, then we have information to go on. And we need to make sure that anyone internally using that data knows what the data is and what it means. I don't know if you said golden record or the golden data, Tammy, before, but if we're manipulating it in any way, then we need to make sure that each and every data field, it means what it means and it says what it means. So there is a big amount of time spent on analyzing that data. That will get easier year over year. I wanted to mention one other thing. I love the idea that Tammy's working group has been taking years to come up with. Many times our managers will send us their internal due diligence information. Sometimes we have to go mine the information. We don't have 100% compliance with every manager going in and logging in and entering the data. However, the majority do. And year over year, we explain to them, we have a new software, or, hey, your previous year response is in there. It's really not that hard. And we get more and more traction with compliance and compelling the managers to respond. I mean, each year, I think the worst year we had 89% of the managers answered on time. And then we finally drove it to 100%, giving us the information, whether we had to mine it a little bit ourselves, or we had meetings with them where we entered the data in the software and they verbally told us. So sometimes it's a combination of getting the information that you need. But we absolutely prioritize that, and we go for 100% compliance, and then we deal with the analytics. And the reporting and the analytics are extremely important.
Nicole, does that align with you?
Much reporting. As I said before, we have a largely manual process on some outdated software.
Yeah.
We actually have to pull the data. We have a technology team that pulls that data from the software into an Excel spreadsheet format and creates alerts for us to look at. So I would say we are well behind Kim in terms of mining and analyzing data, producing KPIs, and producing reporting. We are attempting to move from kind of an antiquated manual process where human beings have to actually look at alerts that are flagged for them and make decisions about, is this what we need? Do we need to go back? Is this really responsive to the question? Does it indicate an issue that we need to go look into further? We're trying to move the administration of it, as I've said before, to a more efficient process where we can have analytics, we can have reporting, we can have KPI. One of the things I really liked about the central software that we intend to use is the ability to flag issues, because that's another thing that happens when you're doing it manually. People have the best of intentions, but if there's a number of issues arising from a quarterly due diligence process, sometimes things fall through the cracks, and we don't want that to happen. We want the ability to flag an issue that's come up with, say, investment manager for future follow-up. So maybe we've had a discussion with that manager. We know where they stand in terms of remediating something in their firm, but we want to keep tabs on it. So we want to have something in the tracker to bring this up at the next meeting we have with them, or in the next questionnaire that we send to them. Right now, that's a manual process of setting up a flag. The software will allow us to do that inside the platform. So we are very much looking forward to that.
So, Kim and Nicole just touched on a really important point, which is it's great to pull in all this data, but you got to look at your data. You got to analyze it, because if your data highlights a problem and you haven't found it, rest assured the SEC will find it and ask, how come you didn't find it? So you're vulnerable for all the information you're pulling in. So whatever you're pulling in, number one, make sure you need it. And number two, make sure you're looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
Which leads me to maybe our final topic. We'll see, because this could be kind of, I don't want to say polarizing, but it's new. It's generative to be leading, and that is large language models, GPT, artificial intelligence. I've seen all different reactions to it and feedback, from the overwhelmingly positive to, we just use this to spell check all of our documents, to writing policies. So we've been pretty far along with using GPT now, working with a couple of large institutions on that to set the framework down. How does that, is that in your sphere right now, in your optics, Tammy, Nicole, and Kim, in that order? Because I do this not because of any favoritism, because my eyes work from left to right, and you're the top left, you're the top right, and Kim, you're right below her, and your background kind of catches me a little bit. But GPT, artificial intelligence, and if so, how? And the reason I'll give you kind of where I'm coming from here, and that is, you're throwing humans at it now, Nicole. You've thrown humans at it and some technology, Kim. Your constituents are probably all over with it, Tammy. As a second set of eyes, not a primary set of eyes, but a second set of eyes for the textual based responses, it's a benefit to people to say, have a piece of technology that says, you didn't answer my question, could you please answer it, without me having to do that. Or take it a step further, the information you're giving me here is in conflict with what's on your ADV or what's in the policy that you attach to my questionnaire. So with that context, Tammy, what say you?
So this is a huge issue, because it's a cutting edge issue. And it's something that I think most firms are looking at in terms of, do we integrate this? Do we prohibit it? What do we do with it? And again, we've got members of all, shapes and sizes. What I'm hearing is a lot of firms are prohibiting the use of it for business purposes. And part of that is concerns with the privacy of the data.
Yep.
Because I understand once you put data into whatever this is, and I'm not a techie, that, that can be out in the public domain. But because there is demand for this, what we see are firms creating like intra chat GPT. So it's something that's available within the firm, but they can control it. So it's not going out into a public domain. So that's kind of on the overall compliance side. But on the operation side, on the technology side, I understand there are huge benefits that can be exploited by firms that deploy this technology. So a lot of our firms have sandboxes where they're currently exploring the uses of this, where it could be beneficial, where the firms, they could provide more efficiency or whatever. So they are, at the same time, they may be prohibiting employee use of it. They have sandboxes internally where they're exploring, the benefits of it. But we just had a CCO meeting last week, and we had a poll during it, and we asked the use of AI in the compliance department. So we asked where any members were thinking about incorporating any artificial intelligence tool into the compliance program. 66% said no, 28% said yes, and we've had 6% say they've already begun that process. So I think it's a trend we'll see going forward, but most today are not deploying AI. And that in part maybe because it's still in a sandbox within their organizations.
Thank you. Kim?
I would say it's too new. I haven't had any internal discussions about it, like with our general counsel and or the head of operations. So I can't comment on it today. I personally have a big interest in it because I'm a geeky, techie kind of person and love data. So yeah, from a personal perspective, yes, I'm interested in it. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens in this space. I don't think it'll ever replace investment due diligence and are asking these questions, but it could be a secondary or third source of information for sure.
Yeah, at Mercer, I think we fall into the bucket that Tammy was speaking to. Probably the largest percentage. It's prohibited for social use, platforms, sales, that type of thing. But Mercer is exploring the sandbox concept of developing an internal use only platform, primarily at this point with the thought toward how can we use this to create policies? How can we use this to review policies? I'll be very interested to see how I feel like it's still early days, and I would be very interested to see how GPT is used in the due diligence process, exactly for the reasons that you highlighted, Scott. Rather than having 5 people read the volumes of policies, procedures, documentation that come in from each of the advisors or service providers, trying to find, combing through, like you said, comparing, well, does this comport to what's over here? Having a technology that can take that first pass is huge. And I always worry about, is there enough time to get through the pile of information that has come in from any one of the advisors that we use? We have deadlines to meet, internal reporting, board reporting, so forth and so on. There's only so much time to get through all of that. So that I start to worry about, is the volume too large? Can we get through it? If we do get through it, what's the quality of the review? Are we just kind of speed reading to check the box and say, well, I read it? But having a technology that could actually kind of quickly scan it for you and either flag anomalies or suggest things to look at, evaluate the responses, if you will, that I feel like that's coming, and it'll be huge. We talk about efficiencies.
Okay. So what I did, and I told you all yesterday I had a surprise for you. I asked ChatGPT the following question. And that is, how can large language models and AI provide benefits to compliance, investment, and operational due diligence functions. And there's a long-winded answer, but I'll give you the segments as broken out by them. Number one, it would be efficiency and time savings, standardization and consistency, automated data analysis, risk identification and mitigation, data accuracy and validation, enhanced collaboration and communication. And then the last one here, actually, there's 4 more. Regulatory compliance monitoring, it will enhance through algorithms, enhanced risk assessment modules, automation of routine tasks, that sound desirable, and enhanced fraud detection. Stay tuned, because we're just starting.
Things started, I feel like that's true.
Well, and Scott, one of the things on your list was, regulatory compliance, and what it makes me think of is, firms that hire, mock auditors, to come in and, kick the tires. The SEC, their document request list in connection with exams now, they'll ask for any, documentation of mock audits. So we advise our members, have your outside counsel hire the mock audit firm so it doesn't, wind up in the SEC's hands. So I can see in the future, the SEC as part of their standardized document request list for a routine exam, asking questions about, what have you heard from AI about your compliance program?
Asking you shall receive. We are at the bottom of the hour, and I want to thank each and every one of you for joining today, specifically Nicole, Tammy, Kim. Actually, I got to go backwards. Kim, Nicole, and Tammy. I'll go Kim first. Alice, thanks for putting this together. I hope you enjoyed it. I appreciate the insight, the commentary, the feedback. I learned a lot. I hope you did. And I look forward to continuing this because we're not done here.
You bet. There'll be a link that will be emailed to all of the attendees. If you have any additional questions, please reach out to Scott directly, or you can visit our website on central.com, and we'd be happy to answer any further questions. But I agree, great conversation today. And thank you so much, Tammy, Nicole, and Kim, for joining us. We appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.